It's great to be on this morning, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time today just talking about what I see in terms of cattle market outlook and some of the risks that I see. I don't think we're done with volatility as we look ahead. I hope that when I get done today, that maybe I've shared what I'm watching as I look in 2021 for where these cattle markets go. I will tell you I'm relatively optimistic, but of course there are some things on the horizon that I think we need to be paying attention to. I start here with, so we have a lot of meat production, and we'll see some graphs here in a little bit that just reminds us of what we have going. For me, COVID-19 has certainly affected cattle markets in particular. Trying to guess exactly how COVID-19 unfolds in 2021 remains difficult for me to get a handle on for certain. I will always remind us that I don't think it's smooth. I will also say I'm optimistic. Optimistic because perhaps with more vaccine in arms, we get the worst of COVID-19 behind us in 2021. We open restaurants. That to me is all bullish potentially for cattle markets. We're going to have to watch feed costs. We haven't been on that for a while, and I think that's one of the things that is a risk that even for us in the cow-calf side of this cattle industry need to be paying attention to. I don't think we're done with volatility and feed costs going forward as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. As we start, though, just to remind us, and some of you that have seen me speak probably for a few years know that I use this graph quite often of what's overall U.S. meat production, and we've been on a really skyrocketing path since 2014. You see that 06 to 14 period of beef, pork, and chicken production was relatively flat in this country, and then we took off. That flatness 06 to 14 got us some really high prices in 2013, 2014. But now we're growing per capita meat supplies. Now, if you want to be positive about 2021 and even into 2022, the flattening of meat production growth for me is a sign to be a little more optimistic in that we're not going to be pushing even more product at consumers as we look ahead. If you think about what we've been doing more generally in the livestock industry, it has been, yes, we're growing production because we're going to export that product. And yes, exports and the black line here being net exports, so exports minus what was imported, did grow the last few years, but at a much slower rate than production grew. And so when you think about what's the difference between that black and gold line, I always say that's you and I eating more meat products. I do my fair share, unfortunately, and it shows in terms of how big I am, I guess. But that usually means we get lower domestic prices as well. So that's what we have to fight through. And here's the graph. It was pretty easy to say back in 2012 through 2014 at 185 pounds per cap of beef, pork, and chicken. It was good times. Those were much tighter supplies. Now that we're back at 205, we're pushing a lot more meat at U.S. consumers. Now I expect, again, 21 and 22, with that slowdown in meat production, we're going to push a little less at consumers. So one could say COVID-19 recovery, a little less meat supplies generally. All could get positive, especially as I think we get further into 2021. If we look briefly at just what USDA is also saying here, all right, so the very top line, just for a second, production of the meats was in 2019 105 billion pounds. It went to 106 in 2020. It's slowing down. USDA saying 106.7. Now the flip side here for a minute, exports, the second set of numbers, you notice USDA is now saying 18.3 billion pounds of those meats are going to go out again in 2021. but no growth after a 1.1 billion pound growth in 2020. Now that was driven in large part by China and pork, but flattening of exports is one of the worries that I might have. But I still think we can talk about higher prices in 2021 um, to, to make sure that make sure that uh, I can be relatively bullish about what I see going on. Um, as we look particularly at the cattle side of the equation here, so we're contracting fewer beef cows. We may have to deal with some short run heavy supplies, but by and large, we're in that contraction phase. We've already talked about the demand side. I frankly been amazed how well beef has moved despite some of the issues with restaurants being shut down. I think it's been the hardest on the beef side. Um, to COVID recovery for a minute. All right, so it's one thing to get caseload down, which we're seeing good signs, at least the last several days of some help here. My concern is what's income levels look like. We've pushed a lot of stimulus out. If we don't see a lot of stimulus in 2021, how much money do consumers have in their pockets to be buying beef products? For me, that's an unknown question, but we could have a hangover, if you will, in terms of some of those economic issues. Looking briefly at the cattle report that we got last week, uh, again, it pretty much confirmed what we all had anticipated of fewer cows. Um, we were at the outside the upper end of the pre-report estimate in terms of the number of beef cows. So yes, we declined, but not as much as we might have thought. And it's interesting where we did decline and did not decline in terms of state by state breakout there. But generally, fewer cattle coming for us ought to be helpful to prices. The drought, all right, so left side here, December 29th of 2020, you see just how serious it was in some western states that matter from a cattle standpoint, especially relative to where we started. I'm always cautious about putting too much emphasis on drought at the end of the year. Of course, when we want to grow pasture is going to be more important. So what happens moisture wise from this point forward could be critical, but we're sure behind, and I think it's created some issues. If you look at the change in beef cows, all right, so you have Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, all three up pretty hard. I kind of wonder if we aren't seeing some movement of cows out of those western states into parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, trying to save some cows until those pastures get in better shape. I will say the report surprised me in that Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, all down. I'm not sure what was happening uh, there to create the down, but quite a mixed bag, and you see a little bit of the drought effects. I think Colorado certainly sticks out as one that saw that decline. The drought has just continued to escalate. You know, if you look at the D1 or worse on average over the 2000 to 2019 period, it was 27.4%. We said here at the end of 2020, a little north of 45%. So it certainly grew quickly as we got in the latter part of this year. It is more Western focused than when we think back to the drought of 2012. Um, I think that's important in terms of just how many cows we might be talking about in terms of being affected. You see kind of the last 4 weeks um, where we have D1 or worse. Um, Texas, we've got some Nebraska issues going on as well. Um, North Dakota as well. So we've seen some expansion of what we might have thought of was more of a Western uh, drought that has changed as we've looked at the last few weeks. I can get optimistic about just the amount of beef we're going to put on the market in 2021 because of what I think will be steer weights that will continue to fall back to previous year's levels. All of the slowdown shutdowns of processing plants back in 2020 due to COVID-19 certainly back cattle up, and it's taken us a long time to get through those. So again, I expect even in higher feed costs should only help this of getting weights back to previous year's levels. It certainly should be helpful to overall beef supplies. We still have a lot of cattle on feed. The gold square that you see on the very left-hand side of this says, hey, we had cattle on feed at the same levels we had going into 2020. So to me, that's where I say the first half of 2021, I think we could still have a lot of cattle supplies to work through. But I think the second half of 2021 could be a lot more positive for us. Production growth, I'm always a little cautious here to look at 2021 on a quarterly basis, but it's worth a little bit of look. And I say that because when you look at the second quarter of 2021, it sticks out because it's up like 12% relative to 2020. But remember, that was the quarter of slowdown shutdowns. So that's abnormally high in 2021 because of the base from 2020. But the idea that we're on this slowdown and actually turn down in beef supplies is important to the mix here for us. Government stimulus has been important, and I think for 2021 will continue to be something we have to be focused on. If you look at current projections, it would say stimulus will be about 27% of GDP. We'll see if that goes up or down as we go through 2021. But we got a lot better demand in 2020, I will say, just again because of how much government stimulus that we had. Demand for beef has been good. Demand for prime off the right-hand side, even in COVID-19, has been a very good situation. So it's good to see that. We have become a net exporter of beef the last little bit of 2020. I think we can thank China for some of what we see on that front. So I'm excited about what could be happening in China as we go forward. I know there's going to be a lot of concern on this side of the wholesale to beef price spread. I just remind us that we've come back down the last several months to something more close to historical levels. This was just a phenomenal period of time with the slowdowns that we saw. The one that I'm paying attention to is what's happening retail to wholesale. We have retail prices that have stayed up pretty high, setting higher prices at consumers, and still worried about just economic recovery. What's that do to demand for beef, I think, is important. These international markets, just to remind us, exports matter a lot. You see the blue line here, China, Hong Kong, and what's happened as we've gone through 2020. If China decides they want to continue to take a lot of U.S. product, I can get really optimistic about what that means for us. I do think we're going to get some recovery in places like Japan, South Korea, as they also recover from COVID-19. So I'm relatively bullish on that trade side. But here's the one, weekly shipments of U.S. beef to China. They've taken 11% of our total shipments over the last 13 weeks. That's all just great news for us from a trade front. And again, China can just make a world of difference. You see the growth expected in 2021. China continuing to grow just a little bit after what was a pretty phenomenal growth in 2020. I'm looking at everybody else as well. So I think we can get some growth in maybe non-traditional markets as we look forward at 2021. The trade side, just to look at exchange rates for a minute, the dollar has weakened considerably as we've gone through 2020 and started 2021. To me, this was the worst of COVID-19, and as we continue to recover, that dollar certainly weakened. It makes our products more attractive to international consumers, so I think that's positive for us as we look ahead. I'll start to wrap up just by saying we got to pay attention to what's happening on the corn side. So 1.5 billion bushels of corn ending stocks in 2020, 2021 is tight. I think we're going to try to plant a lot of corn in this country come spring. It's all going to depend on weather, about how many acres we get in the ground. I won't be surprised for us to be well north of 90 million acres of corn trying to get in the ground. What the weather looks like in the U.S. over the summer, I think, matters to whether corn prices stay high like we've seen the last several weeks. If weather's bad, I think they go higher. If weather's good, I think they could go lower. But we have to plan for that in terms of the risk that we see to, especially feeder cattle prices. What are feed yards going to be willing to pay for calves if they have to continue to feed $5 or higher corn? That risk, again, to me, cuts both ways. Let's not let that hurt us too much from a cattle perspective when we have ways to hopefully kind of reduce that risk. Corn prices come down with planting intentions, maybe saying we're going to plant a lot of corn acres. It might give us a risk management chance to get in. Again, I wouldn't want to not be thinking about some risk management as we get into the summer months and we begin to get focused on what kind of yield we have. So there's just a lot of pieces here. And oh, by the way, demand matters. Export demand for corn, USDA is saying 2.5 billion bushels here in the year that we're in. That's some phenomenal growth. China matters here again. So cuts both ways for China on us, and I think they're also pulling those feed costs higher. You see the effects of the phase one trade deal with China. Oil seeds off the right-hand axis, the other two off the left-hand axis. Suffice to say, we've seen substantial growth, and if that phase one deal continues to unfold in 2021, we should see even more growth in terms of value of exports to China. I think it's good for higher cattle prices, but perhaps we also get higher feed costs to go along with that. But what a phenomenal difference relative to where we would have seen these numbers back in 2018, 2019, when we saw pretty large tariffs in place. Calf prices, again, I can get more optimistic once we kind of get through the current numbers that we have. So I think as we get in late summer, fall of this year, we could see some nice run-ups in those prices. Feed costs, again, are the one for me that's a little concerning in terms of just what the crop might look like. My projections for fed cattle prices continue to show recovery as we go in 2021. You see in this graph just my expectation that the latter part of 2021 is going to be a lot more exciting than the first half of 2021 in terms of prices. On an annual basis, just to give you a little more, to me, we're set up for what could be a couple of years of better prices. Again, recovery from COVID-19 coupled with fewer cows, to me, gives us a chance to talk about cattle prices that we just haven't seen for a few years. For a minute, will remind us we're pushing processing capacity of the cattle side of this equation more than we might have anticipated, and I think that's put us in a tough position relative to where we frankly have been for decades. I might be a little too extreme in my decades comment there, but as we cut available supplies of cattle, I think packers will have to bid a lot harder to keep some chains running at fuller speed. So I want to close just by what are some of the risk things you can do. So simple example, feed 100 calves. You see these assumptions. I don't want you to get too focused on this, but what can should I retain ownership? Number one, the black line here, my base case, on average over the 2000 to 2020 period, there's not a lot of money to feeding cattle on average. You see the volatility that occurs in terms of the ability to feed cattle. I just remind you, if you have calves that, number one, can either get a premium or have better feed efficiency conversion or don't die, those are the things that hedge your bet. Those are risk things that I think you could do in your operation in terms of genetics used, et cetera. So I encourage those that are thinking about that strategy. You got to know what those calves are like. That previous chart was all about not using futures markets to hedge that risk, I do not recommend that strategy. So although you go backwards for a minute, 2017 was a phenomenal year. Don't count on that. I'd much rather hedge than hit those kind of home runs trying to help myself. Hedging doesn't increase returns on average, but it decreases volatility, which is all that gold line tells you when you use risk management relative to just a straight cash transaction like the black line suggests. My last point is you don't have to feed these calves to necessarily get additional value. When I look at Joplin calf prices, it's the first week in November is all I've pulled here, that they've been going up over time, suggesting to me there's a bigger spread from low-end calves to high-end calves. So those calves that folks know a lot more about and know how they're going to feed certainly have been worth more generally in many of these auctions. So I think we're seeing some pull through of added value for those producing calves that, again, feed better and also have better quality. So with that, I don't know if we have any questions, but I'll turn it back over. I sure hope if you have questions longer term, as you see my contact information here, you'll feel free to reach out to me.
Well, I really appreciate the chance to talk to you guys just a little bit. You know, Jill asked me to talk about tracking overall farm profitability. As she said, I'm an ag business specialist with University of Missouri Extension and part of the Division of Applied and Social Sciences. In just a little under 90 days, I will celebrate my 20th anniversary with University of Missouri. So I have enjoyed working with producers, but I also want to say that I'm a farmer. So I'm a cattle producer from Southwest Missouri. My wife's a veterinarian. And so I well understand the challenge of tracking profitability and record keeping. You know, I would ask you, what do you feel like is the worst job on the farm? And most people might say, well, I don't like hauling manure, I don't like fixing fence, but most people would actually end up saying record keeping or bookkeeping is the job that I absolutely hate the most. But you know, I asked the question, why do we keep records? The reality is, I think one of the reasons we hate records so much is because we do it because someone else requires us to. You know, that first one, the IRS requires us to file our taxes once a year. And so that just makes record keeping one of those things we absolutely hate to do because it coincides with having to pay our taxes. Or maybe the bank requires us to do balance sheets for a loan, or maybe, you know, on the production side, Farm Service Agency requires us to keep our production records on how many bushels, or, you know, maybe DNR requires us to say where we put pesticide down. It's always because someone else has required us to do it. But the reality is we should keep our records because it helps us to make better management decisions. You know, it's all about that cost versus return. Are we making money, and how can we change it so that we do make money? You know, even thinking about production performance. That beautiful cow that you have standing in your pasture, how do we know if she is actually making you money or not? The reality may be her calves may have been 100 pounds below the average in the herd. And if you don't have any way of showing that, if you don't have any way of finding that, how are you going to know whether that cow or that what I consider an employee is making you money? We're also going to talk just a little bit later about how do we separate out enterprises? You know, how do we look at what we're doing well and what we're not? There's so many reasons why to keep records, but it's basically to allow us to make better decisions and hopefully make more money in our operation, not because someone else wants us to do it. So if I had a face-to-face audience here, I would ask you, how do you calculate your cost of production? You know, what do you show? What do you do to see actually what your production cost is? And most people would come back, well, you know, I do my taxes once a year, so I have a Schedule F. That's basically my barometer of whether I'm making money or not. And I've used this analogy a lot through the years, but I think everyone's going to understand it now. So, you know, we're getting used to, because of COVID-19, checking our temperature. So, you know, tomorrow, whenever you go to out of the house and go somewhere, you have to check your temperature before you leave to make sure you're not sick. So basically walk out to the tree standing in the yard and grab the big thermometer that, is the size of a large dinner plate that's hanging on the tree. Grab it off the tree, lift up your shirt, stick it in your armpit and see if you're sick or not. Unfortunately, that's basically about the effectiveness of using your Schedule F as a barometer of whether you're profitable or not and what your cost of production is. Because the reality is we have all these little adjustments that we need to make, like inventory changes. If I decide to stick the corn in the bin this year instead of selling it and selling it after the first of the year, is that change in inventory going to affect my profitability? Absolutely it is. Just like calves or breeding stock. If I decide to save twice as many heifers this year, well, that's going to decrease my sales of calves. And so that's going to affect my profitability. What about the time that I go and prepay fertilizer or feed on December 31st? Does that affect my Schedule F profitability? Absolutely it does. Has anybody sold calves in the last quarter of the year and told the sale barn, I don't think I want that check until after the first year. So just put that in escrow for me. All of these things affect our Schedule F profitability because the reality is farmers essentially have two rules when it comes to taxes. Number one is do not pay the IRS if you can at all avoid it. Number two is don't ever forget rule number one. So we use things like depreciation. We'll go buy a $40,000 tractor and we write it all off in the first year. And so that makes our Schedule F look really, really bad. But the reality is, as that tractor went from $40,000 or $80,000 or whatever it is to zero value overnight, absolutely not. So we need to make all of these adjustments to that Schedule F to really get a good barometer of whether we're making money or not. And so if I could convince you to do one thing, it would be basically to sit down and do a balance sheet at the beginning of the year. And so just take 3 hours and think of, how much feed do I have? How many bales of hay do I have? How many cows do I have? How much machinery do I have? How much prepaids have I done? What has happened to my inventory of calves? Have I held the calves over so that I could sell them after the first of the year? Just simply taking a few hours to do a balance sheet, then putting that with my Schedule F and the Form 4797, which is your sales of breeding stock. If I could just do that balance sheet and put that with it, it'll give me a lot better picture of where I'm actually going in the operation. And, there are a lot of really nice free Excel spreadsheets out there that you can download to do this. I just went out yesterday because I knew of one that was on Farm Doc's website, University of Illinois. So I just went down and downloaded it. I know Purdue has got some. There's a lot of really good ones out there. Again, I just grabbed Farm Docs yesterday just to kind of show an example. And so it's simply an Excel spreadsheet. You can basically click on these tabs and put your beginning and ending balance sheets in here. And if you've never done a balance sheet, these spreadsheets actually make it pretty easy. They have these different schedules that you can click on, those yellow buttons there, that you can click on those schedules and put in your machinery and put in your livestock. So that way you just update them once a year. You don't have to go in and re-enter all of it. But once you put those balance sheets in, that'll show you where you're, how much you own and how much the bank owns, essentially, because you put down your liabilities, your loans as well. Then you put in your cash flow entries. And so this is essentially just going back to that Schedule F and pulling off those sources of funds, the cash that comes in from sales of livestock, the cash that goes out in the form of feed expenses, rent, interest payments, things like that. That's the cash in, cash out. You have to account for that depreciation changes because, again, we want to put down what purchases we've made and what things that we've sold, because that depreciation really doesn't tell us what is happening with those expenses. Again, we'll put down a lot of depreciation on our taxes so that it makes the taxes look really bad from a profitability standpoint, but that stuff hasn't all went to zero value overnight. Then we can look at some of the reports that this will generate from that. And because we've made all of those, I just show this, because we've made those inventory adjustments in the balance sheet. It'll be the difference. It'll show the differences between that beginning balance sheet and that ending balance sheet. Because we adjusted for those prepaids and those sales of breeding livestock and things, accounts payables, things like that, it'll allow us to run all of these reports. When I say run reports, it just creates them. It creates them automatically. It'll create your cash flow statement, your income statement, your cash flow budget, your ratio analysis. A lot of people have heard of the Sweet 16 financial ratios. It'll calculate all of that for you. And then you can actually, if you click on this trend analysis button, those Sweet 16 financial ratios, you can click on whichever one you want to see, and it'll essentially show that for you for the last 4 years. And again, it's created that for you simply from us entering the cash in, cash out from our Schedule F and our beginning and ending balance sheet. Again, that was just one example of those programs that you can do and how it will help you get a better picture of where your operation is actually going. But even if you're not willing to take those 3 or 4 hours to do the beginning and ending balance sheet, a lot of people can do this, or everybody can do this because everyone has to file their taxes. But the quick and dirty method is essentially just sitting down and looking at your last 3 to 4 years of taxes. So taking that Schedule F that we know everyone has, and everyone should be really familiar with it because you've had to pull it back out recently to apply for your PPP. And I'll throw that in there now that I think about it. If anyone has not applied for your Paycheck Protection Program, call your banker today and get on the list to apply for that, because that's a excellent stimulus package for farmers. But anyway, I stole this spreadsheet from Joe Horner. He just created essentially an Excel spreadsheet. You can do the same thing simply by pulling out your last 3 to 4 years of Schedule F. Now, the spreadsheet that Joe created, I like that it basically takes, the pounds of calves. So you figure out how many calves you've sold the last 3 or 4 years and then what they weighed. And it'll actually take those costs and divide it out per hundredweight or per cow in your herd. And as you start looking at how those Schedule F numbers equate to per cow, some things will start jumping out at you. And you can learn a lot about your operation from doing this. For instance, my truck and automobile expenses, mileage for my farming operation runs almost $50 a cow. And you might say, wow, that is really high. But a few days ago, I fed my cows and it took me 93 miles to do that because I've got rent farms that are spread out in 2 different counties. And so, that's why my automobile expense is so high. But as you start looking at how does my utilities expense figure per cow, how does my feed expense, my fertilizer expense, all of those things will show you where your major cost categories are and where you're high and where you're low. Then if you will take that and jump over to the University of Minnesota's FinBin website, University of Minnesota maintains these enterprise analysis for all types of different enterprises, for beef, cow, calf, beef backgrounding, beef finishing, dairy, all the row crops, all the different enterprises are in here. And you can run a report that shows on all of the different people that have put their expenses in here on a yearly basis or on a benchmark basis. And so what I did was I just ran out there and looked at the cow calf budget. Not budget. These are actual farms that have put their records in there. I excluded all the other states except Missouri. So I only looked at Missouri operations, and I looked at for the last 10 years. So I'm going to run a 10-year benchmark report. Again, it's kind of interesting to look at if you do all of the states and look at how that compares to Missouri, but I wanted to get just Missouri reports. So I ran this report on just the last 10 years of Missouri operations, and you get this benchmark report of how all these operations compare. And so right up here at the top, you'll see these percentile ranks. And so it's been a long time since some of us were in elementary school and we were ranked to where we were in the percentile among our fellow students. But the way you will read this is, so for instance, let's look at total feed expense. So the average feed expense of all of these operations was $361.50 a cow. But the 10th percentile, basically meaning that 10% of producers had feed expense greater than $691.33, while the 90th percentile, meaning only 90% of producers had feed expense greater than 235, or the other way to read that is 10% of producers had feed expense less than $235 per cow. So once you've looked at those 3 to 4 years of Schedule F on your operation, then you can hop over here and see, well, where do I fall? Am I in the 30th percentile, the 70th percentile? Where do I rank? And then you can go down here and look at utilities or machinery depreciation or repairs and maintenance and all of these things to see where do I fall. So where am I costing more than the average producer here in Missouri? I always like jumping over to the production side of that report and saying, for the average producer that's in here, the average weaning weight was 491 pounds or pounds per exposed female, which takes out the opens of 392. But, how do I compare in there? I always think about my death loss. Sometimes I think I have a high death loss. Well, the average Missouri producer had a death loss of 7.3%. But look, the 10th percentile, basically for this variable, you want to be in the lower percentile. 10% of producers had a death loss less than 1.3%, while the 90th percentile, 10% of producers had a death loss greater than 16.3. So it's always, to me, all of these variables become really critical to look at and see, where do I fall compared to other producers? And you can, as I said, you can even look at other producers around the country, not just Missouri if you want to. And then I think it's good to take that and go back and compare that to the budgets that we put out each year. Joe Horner, Eldon Cole, and I put out a Southern Missouri cow-calf budget. Joe Kanan and Zach put out one for Northern Missouri. I think it's good to go back and look at and see what we are estimating is the cost of production for this coming year and see where you fall in that. I wanted to highlight just real quick, the Kansas Farm Management Association puts out a report where they break out the farms that are in their farm management association, the beef producers, and they break them out by the high profitability third, the middle profitability third, and the low profitability third. And it's always interesting to me to see that the difference between the high profitability third and the low profitability third is $412 per cow over this 5-year time period. But only $152 of that was a difference in gross income. $260 of that was a difference in cost, in the cost of production. And, when I show this picture, occasionally some people will say, well, if it was a different colored tractor, it might not be stuck. I'm not going to get into what color your blood runs, as far as whether you're green, red, or blue. But I show this to remind me of, there's a mathematical theorem called Euler's theorem. And Euler's theorem is pretty complicated, but essentially it's this in a nutshell. In commodity production, the input cost will always rise to consume the value of production. So when we start making money in the cattle industry, what do our input suppliers do? They raise the price of our rent. They raise the price of our feed or fertilizer. So essentially the input costs rise to consume the value of production. So the only way to really be profitable long-term is to do it lower cost than all of your neighbors do. And so, I don't know if you keep your records in something like, if you're a Quicken fan or a QuickBooks fan, that gets to be an ongoing argument about which is better, or whether you have a more expensive system like PC Mars or something like that, or whether you just keep your records in the old-fashioned paper ledger book, which for many people is probably the best system. But however you do it, I want to encourage you to think about, how do I categorize or tag expenses when I'm keeping my records? So if you're using a computer system, it's a little bit easier, but like with Quicken, this is just a screenshot from Quicken. It's really easy when you're listing an expense to put a tag on that and say, does that go to the cow-calf enterprise, or does that go to the hay enterprise, or does that go to wheat production? The reality is all of us in our operations do something really, really well. And all of us probably have an enterprise that we would be better off, that we would make more money if we would let go. But again, if we are not using our records to figure out where that is, then we're not helping ourselves in figuring out where we need to make improvements. Dave Pratt, who was the guy with Ranching for Profit schools for many, many years, I used to hear him talk about, we spend all our time working in the business and we don't step back to take time to work on the business. Again, we're so busy making sure the cows get fed, the hay gets made, and the fertilizer gets applied, all of those things that we work in the business, that we don't take time to step back and work on the business. And so, are your records that someone else requires you to do, or are your records something that you are using to improve your operation? And again, in this day and age of technology, we have never had more tools at our disposal. I mean, I can stand out in the middle of my cows looking at a herd of cows and quickly look at my phone and see when did that cow calve last? What was her weaning weight last year on her calves? Have I ever had to treat her for pink eye? Has she been a repeated problem? Well, we can do the exact same things with our cost too. If we will take a little bit of time when we're doing that record keeping to apply those tags and really look at where our enterprises break out. Love this quote from John Maxwell. Basically says, time management is an oxymoron. Time is beyond our control and the clock keeps ticking regardless of how we lead our lives. Priority management is the answer to maximizing the time we have. So again, I just want to challenge you a little bit to think about, can I step back and use my record keeping system to work on the business and to figure out where are my strengths and where are my weaknesses? Because again, I can't stress that enough. All of us do some things really, really well, but we've all got some weak areas. So figuring out where those weak areas where we are more expensive than the average producer, look at that fin-bin analysis. And again, that takes about 5 seconds to run that fin-bin analysis. Once you select which states you want and what years you want, it takes about 5 seconds for that report to run. And then you can exactly look and see where you rank in the percentiles of other operations around you.